In this video, I'll be going through a bunch of list functions in Power Query. To begin with, what is a list? A list is basically any assortment of values, and it can be compared to a column without a column header. Because you can generate a list by taking a table and referring to a specific column, like so. Here I have a basic table, and I then make a new step where I say go into this table, the previous step. Then in square brackets, I refer to column 1, and I now get a list that contains all of the values. So this is functionally the same as the column, but without the column header. Another way to write a list is to manually write one, where you use the curly brackets. This is just a basic list, and the cool thing with list is you can also have varied data types, so it really doesn't matter. There's no data type restriction. You can also generate a list if, for instance, you need the numbers 1 through 12 or the text A through Z. You still use the curly brackets, but then you write the first value, in this case 1, 2 dots, and then the endpoint. And this is inclusive, so from and including 1 to and including 12. And likewise, I can do it with text, because Power Query is smart enough to realize what I'm trying to do. That I want all of the letters between an inclusive A to Z and inclusive Z. And it gets a bit confused if you want to use the Danish extra letters A, Ö, O, because the way the Unicode actually works, if I can find the small letter A, it starts here at the characters 97 in the decimal system. That gives you A. Then I guess it doesn't really show A, Ö, O here, but I can see that you need to go all the way down here, all the way down to the bottom to get A, Ö, O. And it doesn't actually include Ö or A because they are different characters. So that's just something to keep in mind if you want to generate a list that has all of the letters. So if I wanted to create a list with all of the letters in the Danish alphabet, I'd want to do this, and then A, and then Ö, and then O. And I would get my letters. The first function I want to show is then the list split function, which, as the name implies, takes a list and splits it into multiple lists. So it will output a list of lists. It wants a list, which in my case is the previous step source, and then how many items do I want inside of the list. So let's just say 3, and I will get the first 3 letters in one list and the next 3, and so on. In my case, my list doesn't have an amount of items that can be divisible by 3, so this last list will only have 2 items. I'm not sure what you would use this for, but I'm sure there's some purpose, because you can now refer to a specific index. So in my case, if I want DEF, I could say I want to go into this list. Actually, let me do that in a new step. I want to go into my list, which is the previous step. Then I want to go into index position 1, which is not the row 2. It is index position 1 because the index starts at 0. Now I get access to DEF, which I'm sure you can use for something. The next 4 functions all belong to the set grouping. First difference, and let me again start out with a list that goes from the number 1, not the text 1, to 10. And then I can make another list that has, let's say, just the odd numbers inside of that range. And the list.difference function will then do exactly what you expect. They will find the items inside of the first list that can't be found in the other. So this is like an anti-join in database language. So what is my list that I want to remove items from? That is the source step. And the list that contains the items I want to remove is custom 1. So now I get only the even numbers. I could also do something like, maybe I want to remove the items between 3 and 5. This could be useful if you want to remove certain people from a list in case you have them in a list and not in a table. The intersect function is similar to an inner join, meaning it will only return those items that can be found in both lists. And here the syntax is not list 1 and list 2, it is lists as list. So you need to provide in curly brackets all of your lists. So in my case, it's still source and custom 1. So this would be my list 1 and list 2, and then wrap these in curly brackets, which would give 3, 4, 5, because those are the items that can be found in both. So let me add another item here, which would be 11. This can't be found in both lists, which means it will be excluded. The next function is the union function, which will look at which items can be found in total in the 2 lists in combination. In my first list, I don't have 11. In my second list, I have 3, 4, and 5, which are found in the first, but it does have 11. So when I create a union of the 2, I add the 2 lists together and then remove duplicates, basically. And this also requires me to pass in my lists inside of the curly brackets because it takes lists as list. And this is exactly what I expect. I don't have any duplicates, so that's fine. The last function in the sets group is the zip function, which can also be used later on if you want to do list accumulate. And what this does is it will combine the 2 lists into a list of lists Here you'd normally want to have an even number of items. So you'd want 10 rows in the first list and 10 in the other. This can be used if you want to have a spelling mistake you're searching for, and then what value do you want to replace it with. And this is what I'll do in the list accumulate portion. This also take lists as lists. So again, I need to wrap my two lists inside curly brackets. So now I have the first item from the first list and the first item from the second list. And because I only have 4 items in the second list, when I go down to the last rows in this zipped version, I will have a value from the first list and a null from the second, because I don't have an even number of rows. I would only use this function when I want to do list accumulate. The next grouping of functions are what I'd call simple functions, except for the last one, that's not simple, but we'll get to that. The first is list random, which does exactly what you expect. It gives you how many rows do you want, so let's say 12, and it gives me random values that have values between 0 and 1. And if I wanted to make this not random, I don't know why I'd want to do that, I can add a seed which will generate the same numbers every time. So if you wanted to pretend to have some randomization but not actually do it, this is the function for you, which you should not be doing, but I will keep your secret. The next function is the list select function, which is similar to the table select function in that you can determine based on a condition what items you want from the list. So if I just bring over the list random list, I can say I only want to include those rows where the value is greater than 0.5. And now the numbers updated because I didn't provide a seed, so the values get recalculated. My list is still source, and my selection criteria is then here I need the each keyword because I'm evaluating each individual row. So I want to say each item in the list should be greater than 0.5. And actually, if I press the update, it should update every time because the source step is randomized every time. So that's nifty. The next function is the list range function, which lets me either skip a certain amount of items at the start, or it can also say how many items do I want to extract. So in my case, maybe I want to remove the first items, and this is similar to in a table where maybe the first 2 rows are blank and you want to remove those. Again, my list is my source, and the offset is how many do I want to skip, which is 4 in this case. And likewise, I can also say after I skip this amount of rows, how many items do I then want to extract. And this is then a second argument. I say I want to skip the first 4, and I also only want to extract 4. The next function is list positions. And this does also exactly what you expect it to do. It will give you the index position of the given item, which is then 0 through the last item. The point of this function could be that you want to extract a given item based on its position, but you can already do that simply by passing that in. So here I'd say source, this is my list. Then in the curly brackets, I want to say what index position do I want. In this case, I might want the D. So I'd input index 3 because the fourth row is index 3, and then I get D. And then I could then say, okay, so the fourth row has the index position 3, but I can just say -1 to go from row to index. So I personally can't see the point of this. Maybe someone can. The next function is one I've used in the table version, not in the list version, where you want to insert a row or multiple rows either before a position or after a position. In my case, this was where I had column headers that I needed to fix. So I needed to insert the column headers in the first row and then raise them to be the new column headers. So I have again a simple list 1 through 12, and I want to insert into this list. And the position I then want to insert into could be 0, and then my values would be 13. So now this gets added to the start, which is obviously gross to look at. So instead, if I want to add this to the bottom, instead of saying 0, I could say list.count, which will then simply count how many items do I have in my list. And the list I'm looking into is then my source step. So this will be added to the bottom. So let's just run this piece of code on its own to see the value it gives. This will give the position 12, which is then the row. So this gets inserted after the 12th row. And just for giggles, you could also insert the value in the middle. You'd need to extract the index position in the middle. And here I can be a little lazy and say I don't care if it's the exact middle, because if you have an odd number, you can't divide it by 2 and get an even number. So I could start out by saying I want to do a list count of my source, which is then 12. That's how many rows I have. Then divide that by 2 to get the middle position. And in case I have an odd number, so let's just add 0.05, which actually should be a full stop and not a comma. I then want to convert this into the integer version. And I'm just going to round down. I guess it doesn't really matter if you round up or down. So I'm going to do type conversion to make this a whole number, to always make sure that I get a whole number, basically. I can then insert that inside here to the position. Now I have 13 in the middle. if you wanted that for some reason. The last simple function is the list alternate function. The list alternate function can do multiple things depending on what arguments you pass in. Let's say I want to skip the first item. I could use the list range function, but I can also use the list alternate function to say here, my source, I want to skip the first item. I can also add multiple arguments to the list alternate function. In this case, I want to skip the first item, so 1, and then I want to skip every other row. I don't know why you'd want to do this, but I think it's funky. So let me add some actual code commenting to say what it does. And you can make it even more trippy, which is honestly hard to explain. So this is something I got from the Power Query page on Microsoft Help, which is where I want to skip the first item, and then I want to take 2, meaning I skip 1 item, then I take 2, so 2 and 3, then I skip 1, 4, then I take 2, 5 and 6, skip 7, take 2, skip 10, and so on. Again, I don't know why you'd want to do this, but you can do it, and you can even add an offset to this, and this will simply get even funkier. And honestly, I would have a difficult time explaining what it does, except simply to say, hey, look at what it does. So now it takes 1 and 2 and skips 3, 4 and 5. So I really don't see when you'd want to do this. Maybe someone is smarter than me and can explain what it does. I just think it's neat. List generate. And I hinted at this in another video, and I said it needed its own video to explain it. And basically, it allows you to do looping. So it says, what is the initial value? And this has to be passed in as a function. But I don't want any arguments, so I write open and close parentheses and then the rocket ship operator. So I have an empty function that takes no arguments and it outputs 1. And you can also call this the seed or the start value. The name seed will make sense when I get to the list accumulate function. I then have to say what is my looper condition. I want to keep looping while this condition is met. So this is a do while loop. I have access to the each and the underscore character because I am looping, so I can say what is my current value. And I want to keep looping as long as my current value is equal to or less than 12. And what do I then want to do after I've confirmed that my value is less than or equal to 12? Well, the value of the next loop should then be each, so it should be equal to itself, and then I want to add 1 to it. And what you can see is that this complicated syntax is the same as simply writing curly bracket 1 dot dot 12 curly bracket. Because all it does is it says to start at 1, to keep going as long as the value is less than or equal to 12, and then add 1 each time. I start out at 1 and say, okay, is my current value equal to or less than 12? Yes, it is. Then calculate the next value, which is then plus 1, so 2. And this keeps going until I'm in 12. I then say, okay, is my value equal to or less than 12? It is 12. And it gets a bit tricky to understand here at the end, because now my value is still equal to or greater than 12, which would then mean the next value is 13, but the 13th value is not less than or equal to 12, so the loop terminates. So if I remove this equal sign, I will get up to 11, which is not what I want. But when I'm in the 11th iteration, I add 1 to my value, and that value is less than 12, so the loop terminates. That's why it can be a bit tricky to understand, because why is my last value 12 and not 13? Well, that's because it checks whether it should keep going before it adds the next value. At least that's the way I think of it. You can then also do the reverse, where I want to start from 12 and go down. Again, I'll say list generate, and my starter value is now a function that generates the value 12. And what is my condition to keep looping? That is that the value should be greater than 0. And what do I then want to do? What should my next value be? It should take the current value and then minus 1. So now I start at 12 and I stop at 1 because 1 is greater than 0. But then the next value would be 1 minus 1, that's 0, which is not greater than 0, so it terminates. You don't have to make the step 1 plus 1 or minus 1. You can also make it more funky. So in my case, I want 3's. So this is a function you can't generate with a simple curly bracket dot dot syntax. Again, I want my function to start at 12, and I want it to keep going as long as the value is greater than 0. But this time I want to take the current value and say minus 3. So now I'll get 12, 9, 6, and 3. And because 3 minus 3 is 0, and 0 is not greater than 0, it will terminate. If you want to make a calendar date in Power Query instead of inside a Power Pivot via tags, then you could use the list generate function to generate a list of all of the days between the first day of the year and the current day of the year. This time I want my value to start at 1, because I will always start on the first day of the year, the 1st of January. First, I want to extract the date from today, which is then datetime local now. And then I want only the date portion from that. And I want to say this value, so the current day minus the date from the start of the year. And that should also be from the current day. So this is the about 100th day of the year minus the first of the year. So this would generate about 100. And then I want to convert that into a number. I simply need to mind my parentheses here. So I think this should be fine. In each loop, I want to add 1 to the last value. This gives me an error because this is the duration. So that's why I want to convert this into a number first. Now I have from the first day of the year until 100. So apparently the 10th of April is the 100th day of the year. And a smart person would probably convert this into a variable. So let me do that because I want to think I'm smart. So I want to let days from 1st Jan be equal to this value and use that inside of this query. So now I can just write days from 1st Jan instead, just to keep the calculations outside of my generator. If I then wanted to turn this list into an actual calendar table, I could then refer to this query just to keep things separate and first convert this list into a table, which would just give me numbers, and then add a new column. I want to use the add days function. And because my first value is 1, I want to have my start date not be the 1st of January of the current year. I want it to be the date, so the hashtag date function. And then I can say year from. So I want the year and then -1 and then the 12 and 31. And then I want to add the values from column 1. And that is wrong because this is a function, so it needs open and close parentheses. And I always think it's silly that when you write datetime local now, it doesn't add the open close parentheses because this is a function. So I think Microsoft dropped the ball on that one. Now I have all of the days from the first day of the year, of the current year, until, well, actually yesterday. So actually I should say +1 here. That was a good catch actually. Now I have the 10th of April, which is what I expect. But I guess it does generate the number of days from between today and the 1st of January, but then you need to add one because it doesn't include the current day. Because when I create the calendar table, I base it on not the 1st of January, but the 1st of January -1, so I would have to add one later. So if I instead here in the hashtag date, I instead say just the date year and not minus, I would get the next year. So I don't want that. So if I instead say the 1st of January, now I get the 2nd of January. So I don't want to add, but I could probably fix that by having the function start at 0. So let's try that. Then say I shouldn't say +1, and then it will work. Yeah. So if you want to use list generate to generate the number of days between the 1st of January and the current day, then I'd recommend having the list generate start at 0. And then when you actually create the column that converts the day column into the date column, then do this. Start out on the 1st of January of the current year, and then add the value. Because it will start at 0, your first value will be the 1st of January. The next grouping is called transformations. So the first function should of course be the list transform function. I'll start out with a basic list going from 1 to 10. How do I then want to transform it? I just want to multiply it with itself. So my list is still the source step, and my transformation is then for each row, I want to take its current value and multiply it with itself. So now it will replace the original value with the new value, which is just multiplying the value by itself. Here you could also do more complicated things, and you could probably also add an if statement if you really want to. The next function is difficult to explain, so I've started out with this list that contains a record, and inside that record I have another list. In this case I have a list of employees. So this list of records is functionally the same as a table, which is why when you click on the actual record you would see the column names, so bossman and employees. So you would only really get this if you load a JSON file or something similar to it, where you could have a list inside of a column, inside of a list, inside of a column, where you could have multiple values inside of one item. So you could have a company that has multiple sub-companies that have different addresses. So it might have 4 addresses. So that's probably a convenient and a compact way to have that many informations, but I would rather have one table per company then and one row per employee. But I don't make those data sets. What I want to do is to convert this list of records, where the record contains a list, into a list of records where you have one record per employee. So because Markime has 4 employees, I want to have 4 rows where it says Bossman, Markime, Employee Archie, and Power, and so on. And the list transform manic function will do just that. I will preface it by saying it's weird to explain and it's weird to understand. So I don't see myself ever needing to actually use it. Again, what is my list? That is my source step. And here I have this strange word collection transform as function. And all I need to do is I want to provide it the list within my list that has my actual values I want to transform. Because I want to transform that list into multiple rows. So I would say each employees. It would help if I knew how to spell. For each item inside of the list employees inside of my list source that contains. So for each item in my employees list, which is found within the individual records of my list source, I want to do something. And this is then a result transformation as function. So I need to provide a function which takes two arguments. I will call them my column headers at bossman and employees. And these arguments should go towards, and then want the bossman column. So I want to create that list of record again, but this time I don't want multiple employees inside of a list. So I want to create a new record where the bossman column is equal to the bossman column. So I want to create a new record that has the column name bossman, and that should be equal to bossman because that is the name of the column. This is a very weird function. And then I want my new column to not be called employees because I only have one. I'll instead call it employee, and that should be equal to the employees argument. So my output is what I expect, a list of records where each record then has a column called bossman and a column called employee. But you can see why it's strange. And actually also I messed that up, I guess. I don't exactly know what I did wrong. Copying over the code and then adding indentation fixed it, even though it was the exact same thing I wrote. So maybe editor me can figure out the mistake, but I can't. In any case, to explain this more, now that I have the output I want, I'm saying go into the source step, which contains a list within a record within a list. And here I want to extract the employees column of the inner list. And what I want to do with it is then to create a function that takes two arguments, because I want to create a record that has two column names. And I want the boss man column to have the value of go into the boss man argument and go into the boss man column. So here I could also call this A. So I don't have to call it bossman if you think that makes most sense. So I could also call this outer list maybe. Actually, I should call this outer record because I'm not accessing the outer list. I'm accessing the outer record. I'm saying for each row inside of my nested list employees, which has multiple values. So for each of these 4 rows, I want to go into the outer record and say that the new column name bossman, because here I'm saying the output of my function should be a record. So the bossman column should be equal to the value inside of the outer record, says column bossman, and the new column employee should be equal to the employee's value, which is then the same as this inner list. So it's simply grabbing the value of the current row. And honestly, I just took the help for this function and then renamed it because it's such a weird function. And again, I can only really see this being used if you have a data set that is a JSON file and maybe something crashes when you try to extract the values. Because you would get a column that has a list or records inside it and then you need to extract that. I don't see myself using it, but I thought it was fun, so I wanted to include it. Here I have a table with some column headers and I have some mistakes. Let's say that I have a table from SAP and sometimes the delivery date column is written correctly and sometimes it is not written the way I want it to. And you could always go in and say, hey, if I find this column, I want to replace it with delivery date. And of course I can't right now because that already exists. And you could do something like, if this column name exists, I want to replace it with delivery date. But that becomes cumbersome, especially when you have multiple columns that have mistakes in them. So instead I want to do it at once. This first example will be more simple, and I simply want to say if I can find a column header with the value inside of my list of mistakes, then I want to replace it with the correct value delivery date. So first I create a list that has the values that I want to search for, which in my case is very simple because I have the 3 examples here. And I need a list because that's what the list accumulate function takes as its argument. And it's a bit difficult to explain the list accumulate because it's not useful on its own. You need to combine it with another function. In my case, I want to transform the column names. Again, this is based on a real example where I had this incident where a column would change names and it could change to multiple values. So I want to use transform column names, which takes the table source, and then the name generator is a function. And here I want to say for each column name inside of my table, I want to perform this function upon it. So list accumulate, I think of it as a double looper function because I am saying I want to go through each column name one at a time. And then I want to compare this to each item inside of my list. So I will compare this value to each of the 3 items inside of my list. And actually before I get any further, I should change this name. So for each column inside of my table, if I can just get IntelliSense to work again. Yeah. For each column header inside of my table, I want to perform this function, which is then list accumulate, which in itself is complicated. But first, it takes a list as a list, which is my list of headers to find. And what is my seed? Just like I did in list generate, this is my starter position, which is then my current column that I'm looking at. So this is where it gets confusing because I'm double looping. So my starting value is the column header itself, and I am comparing this column header to all of the items inside of my list. My accumulator function is then, and this is just terminology you need to accept, it's called state, current, and this goes towards something because it's a function. And the state is equal to the seed, so that's why in my notes I write an arrow from state up to the underscore, and I write an arrow from the current up to list of headers. So I'm saying my state is the current column name that I'm looping through in the outer loop, and current is the current item inside of my list that I'm looping through. So this is my outer loop and this is my inner loop. The function I then want to go towards is the text replace function, where I want to say the item that I'm currently looking at is the state item, which is the underscore, which is the current column header. And the old value is the current item inside of my list, which is the spelling mistakes. And what I want to replace it with is then the correctly spelled delivery date. In other words, I'm saying I want to take the current column header, I want to compare that to each item inside of my list. And if there's a match between the two, in other words, if this column is one of the columns with a spelling mistake, then I want to replace that text with delivery date. Now, because all of these 3 columns had a spelling mistake and I'm not allowed to have multiple columns with the same name, these will get 1, 2, and 3 added. So if I, instead of saying I want to go into the source table, I instead say I only want to extract 1 column, which I can do with the table select columns function. I want to go into the source table and I only want to extract the delivery date column. So now it's delivery dates with a plural s, then I get the correct column header. But I don't want to do that. I now want to show a more complicated scenario where I have multiple columns with spelling mistakes. In this case, I have the 4 spellings that I showed in the last query, and then I also have a mistake in order date and payment option, which means now I don't want to replace a mistake with delivery date every time. I want to replace it with a new value. Like before, I'm going to create a list which contains, that's because I'm copy pasting code, because you don't need to see that again. This is my headers that I want to find, or I should say if I can find these, I want to replace them. And I want to replace them with this corrected version. So this is correct spelling. And again, notice that I'm matching the index positions. So the first item is delivery date without a space, and the first item is delivery date with a space. And then I can simply use list zip to combine the two. And also I forgot the curly brackets. Now I have my list of lists where the first item or index position 0 is the wrong spelling and index position 1 is the correct spelling. And because my original column has the four spellings of delivery date and I don't need that, I instead want to only extract the 3 columns with spelling mistakes. Again, I want my table transformation function to be transform column names. And I really would love it if IntelliSense always worked. My name generator is still list accumulate, and this time the list I'm looping through is list zip, which is actually a list of lists. So I will need to refer to index positions to know if it should be the first item or the second. And the seed is still the original column header, so underscore, and my function is still state, current. And this is simply syntax you need to accept because this is what you get when you Google the function. Again, my function is text replace. What is my original text? That is state, and it really would be nice if I could get IntelliSense. I think it's because I'm missing parentheses maybe. I still say this is the text that I want to evaluate. I want to say if this is equal to the current item inside of my list, but it's not just one item because it's a list of lists for index 0, so the spelling mistake. And if these two are the same, or rather I should say, if I can find the spelling mistake inside of the original column header, then I want to replace that portion current 1. And my problem is that my comma is inside of my comments, so that would help. Here my mistake is I wrote list zip with a capital Z, which refers to a query in itself, and I want to refer to the step, which is with a small z, and Power Query is case sensitive, and here you have an example of how that can mess you up, because this is what I expect to see. You can also see that the list accumulate function is rather cumbersome and confusing, because it's not just itself, it is inside of another function. In my last example, I want to do list accumulate, but instead of using a list or a list of lists using list zip, I want to use a list of records instead. It might be easier to explain other people that have to take over your code. I'm going to cheat and copy that because I'm still working with the same table with the same spelling mistakes. And when you copy code, you need to delete the original equal sign. I'm saying create a list, curly brackets, where I want a record whose column is called original and the second column is called correct, and then the values, which generates the list of records. So this would make sense if you have maybe multiple columns, which I don't think you should do for list accumulate, or maybe you just want to make it more clear to the user what the function actually does. Because I can see how this is very confusing to look at, because what does current mean and what does state mean? And especially also what does 0 refer to and what does 1 refer to? So this is definitely more pedagogical. I'm still only extracting the 3 columns with spelling mistakes, and it's the same spelling mistakes as in the last query. I'm still using transform column names, but I could also use the replace text function, which I've done where I had to replace spelling mistakes, but it's the same basic logic. Again, my table is called relevant columns, and again, IntelliSense wants to bully me, and again, the function is each because it's each column name, and I want to apply list accumulate. Now it also wants to bully me with indentation. My list is still the list of records, and I guess here I have a conflict because I have another step called list of records in another query, maybe. So list of records, and my seed is still the underscore, the current column name, and my accumulator is still state, current, which goes toward text replace function. So I'm applying text replace on each column. Actually, for each item inside of my list, I'm applying text replace on the column. The text I am checking is still the state, the current column name, and this time, instead of referring to current 0, I'm referring to current original. And if I can find current original within state, so if I can find the spelling mistake inside of the text, then I want to replace it with current correct, which also does exactly what I want. So you can decide for yourself if you think it's worthwhile to create a list of records, because it does require you to have to write this original and correct every time, and is a bit more effort if you think it's worthwhile, or if you can live with just writing a list with the wrong spellings and one with the correct spellings, and then use list zip. Alternatively, you can also skip using list zip by straight up writing a list of lists. So my outer list and then my inner list could be wrong and it could be right. So now I also have a list of lists. But all depends on what you think makes most sense and what's easiest to read and easiest to understand in the future when you have to read the query again, or if you have to add another spelling mistake. So, yep,